Black firefighter saves racist boss's house, then shocks him with a big reveal. In a bustling city, a black firefighter named Jamal arrives at the station, ready for another day of service. As he gears up, he overhears his boss, Mr. Wilson, making disparaging comments about him to a colleague. "They think just because we have to hire these diversity hires, they can do our job," he scoffs, unaware that Jamal is within earshot. The sting of those words lingers in the air, fueling Jamal's determination to prove himself, even if his boss can't see his worth. The day started like any other at the fire station. The sun barely peeked through the clouds, casting a muted glow over the city as firefighters filed in for their morning briefing. Among them was Jamal, a dedicated black firefighter, who had spent years training and preparing for a job he loved. Yet, despite his passion and commitment, he often felt like an outsider in a profession that struggled with inclusivity. As Jamal tied his boots, he could hear snippets of conversation from the other firefighters. Their camaraderie was palpable, filled with laughter and light-hearted teasing. But when Mr. Wilson, their boss, entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence that signaled his arrival. He had a reputation for being strict, but what troubled Jamal more was the casual racism that often colored Mr. Wilson's remarks. "All right, everyone, listen up," Mr. Wilson barked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. He scanned the room with a hawkish glare, landing on Jamal for a moment longer than necessary. "We've got a busy day ahead. Let's make sure we're all pulling our weight, especially our new diversity hire." The comment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jamal felt his stomach drop as the other firefighters shifted uncomfortably. He forced a smile, knowing that reacting would only escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on his duties, trying to shake off the sting of the words. It was a familiar routine for him: ignore the jabs, work hard, and prove himself through action. As they moved into the briefing, Mr. Wilson continued to dominate the conversation, his tone condescending. "Now, remember, we need to maintain our reputation. No screw-ups. I expect everyone to stay sharp. And Jamal," he said, turning his attention directly to him, "don't think just because you're here, you can slack off. This is serious business." The other firefighters exchanged glances, some visibly cringing at their boss's tone. Jamal clenched his fists, feeling the heat rise to his cheeks. He had trained tirelessly for this role, passing every test thrown his way, and yet here was Mr. Wilson, reducing his achievements to mere tokenism. The words, "diversity hire," echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the uphill battle he faced every day. Throughout the briefing, Jamal remained composed, keeping his head down and taking notes. But it was hard to ignore the tension. The other firefighters were supportive, but they were also cautious, not wanting to stir the pot with their boss. It was a delicate balance, and Jamal often felt like he was walking a tightrope, striving to prove his worth while navigating a minefield of prejudice. As the briefing concluded, Mr. Wilson called out to Jamal as he turned to leave. "Make sure you're ready for whatever comes our way today," he said with a smirk. "I'd hate for you to be the reason we're short-staffed." Jamal took a deep breath, reminding himself that he needed to rise above the negativity. "I'll be ready, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He knew he had to stay focused, not just for himself but for his team. The day dragged on, filled with routine training exercises and maintenance tasks. Jamal excelled at everything they did, but with each success, Mr. Wilson's dismissive comments followed like a shadow. It was a constant reminder of the barriers he faced, not just from his boss but from a system that often struggled to see beyond race. During lunch, Jamal sat with a couple of his colleagues, trying to find solace in their camaraderie. They chatted about everything from sports to family, sharing jokes that lifted the mood. Yet, even in these moments, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was under constant scrutiny. He felt the weight of being the only one, the pressure to represent not just himself but his entire community. "Don't let him get to you, man," one of his colleagues said, a wiry guy named Dave who had always been supportive. "You know you're good at what you do. Just keep proving him wrong." Jamal nodded, grateful for the encouragement. "I just wish he could see me for my skills, not my skin color," he replied, frustration creeping into his voice. Dave shrugged. It's not fair, but you'll get there. Just keep doing your thing. The conversation shifted, but the words lingered in Jamal's mind. He knew he had to stay focused, but as the hours passed, the tension between him and Mr. Wilson only grew. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the station, an emergency call came in. A residential fire had broken out in a wealthy neighborhood, and the team was immediately dispatched. Jamal's heart raced with excitement and anxiety. This was his chance to prove himself, to show Mr. Wilson that he was more than just a diversity hire. As they arrived at the scene, the reality of the situation hit him hard. Flames engulfed the house, and smoke billowed into the sky. Mr. Wilson barked orders, trying to maintain control, but Jamal could see the fear in his boss's eyes. It was a stark reminder that when lives were on the line, prejudices fell away, and what mattered most was skill and bravery. "Jamal!" Mr. Wilson shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Get in there and see if anyone's trapped. We need to act fast." Without hesitation, Jamal donned his gear and rushed toward the burning building. The heat was intense, and the smoke stung his eyes, but he pressed on, driven by the urgency of the situation. As he entered the house, he could hear muffled cries coming from upstairs. "Stay low," he shouted, urging anyone inside to move toward the sound of his voice. Adrenaline coursed through him as he navigated the darkened hallways, the heat wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. It was in this moment of chaos that Jamal realized the stakes were higher than ever. This was not just about proving his worth to Mr. Wilson, it was about saving lives. As he reached the second floor, the flames roared behind him, and he could see the silhouettes of people huddled together in a bedroom. They were scared and disoriented, but Jamal's presence seemed to bring them a glimmer of hope. "Follow me," he urged, his voice firm yet calm. "We're getting you out of here." With every step, Jamal felt the weight of Mr. Wilson's prejudices bearing down on him. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the lives he was trying to save. The night was thick with an unsettling stillness as Jamal and his fellow firefighters settled into the routine of the evening shift. Laughter and banter echoed through the firehouse, but as the clock struck 10, a piercing alarm shattered the calm. The call came through with urgency: a house fire at Mr. Wilson's residence. Jamal's heart raced. The very man who had belittled him, doubted his abilities, and reduced him to a mere statistic was now at the center of an emergency. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, mixing dread and anticipation. As they slid down the pole and jumped into the fire truck, Jamal felt an array of emotions flooding through him: anxiety for the family, anger at Mr. Wilson, and a fierce determination to prove himself. "Let's move!" "Lights and sirens," shouted the captain, and the truck roared to life, tearing through the city streets. Jamal's mind raced with the potential scenarios they could face. The thought of being called into a situation that could mean life or death for the Wilson family drove him to focus entirely on the task at hand. As they approached the scene, the fire blazed brilliantly against the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. Firefighters from other stations were already on site, battling the inferno that was consuming Mr. Wilson's opulent home. The sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying: flames licking at the eaves of the roof, thick black smoke billowing out of broken windows, and the frantic energy of emergency responders swarming the area. Jamal leaped from the truck, adrenaline surging as he grabbed his gear. He could hear the chaos unfolding: shouts, the crackling of flames, and the unmistakable sound of fear echoing through the night. His heart pounded in rhythm with the urgency of the moment as he quickly assessed the scene. "Where's the family?" he shouted to a fellow firefighter, a burly man named Tom, who was already coordinating the teams. "They're still inside. Mr. Wilson is trying to find them," Tom replied, pointing toward a frantic figure silhouetted against the firelight. Jamal's eyes locked onto Mr. Wilson, who was pacing back and forth, his face twisted in panic. The boss was in a state of utter chaos, oblivious to the fire that threatened everything he held dear. "Help! Someone help! My family is in there," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. The sight of Mr. Wilson in such a vulnerable state was jarring. Jamal had only seen the man as the cold, dismissive boss, never as a desperate father. The flames danced dangerously close to the edge of the house, and Jamal felt a surge of urgency. This was no longer about proving himself to Mr. Wilson, this was about saving lives. Jamal, we need you to lead the rescue upstairs, Tom commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. You're the best we have at navigating these kinds of situations. Jamal nodded, his mind sharpening with focus. He steeled himself, blocking out the memories of Mr. Wilson's dismissive comments. In this moment he was not just a firefighter, he was a lifeline. Let's move, he shouted, gathering a small team as they rushed toward the entrance of the house. The heat radiating from the flames was intense, a fierce reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond the threshold. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his gear press down on him. As he pushed through the front door, the acrid smoke enveloped him, making it hard to see. He raised his hand to his face, feeling the fabric of his mask close around him. Stick close. We're going to find them, he yelled to his team as they ventured further into the house. They moved cautiously through the living room, the fire roaring in the background, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction. Jamal's instincts kicked in as he scanned the area for signs of life. The smoke was thick, and visibility was nearly zero. He knew time was of the essence, every second counted. Anyone here? Jamal called out, hoping against hope that someone would respond. His voice was swallowed by the smoke and chaos, but he pressed on, moving deeper into the house. As they navigated through the first floor, the heat intensified. Flames crackled around them, licking at the walls, eager to spread further. The smell of burning wood and smoke was overpowering, but Jamal's training took over. He pushed forward, forcing himself to focus. Suddenly, from upstairs he heard muffled cries. Help! We're trapped! The sound sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through him. That's them! Jamal shouted, racing toward the staircase. Go! I'll cover you, one of his colleagues yelled, staying behind to keep the flames at bay while Jamal ascended the stairs. Each step was a battle, the heat increasing with every moment he spent inside. As he reached the top, Jamal paused, taking a moment to gather himself before pushing through the smoke-filled hallway. The cries grew louder, urging him on. He pressed forward, his heart pounding as he approached a closed door. Is anyone in there? He called, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. We're coming to get you. Please. We're in here, a panicked voice replied. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. He kicked the door open and rushed inside, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the cries. Inside, he found Mr. Wilson's wife and 2 young children, huddled together on the floor, terror etched on their faces. The smoke hung thick, making it hard to breathe, but Jamal pushed aside his own fear. You're safe now. Follow me. He gestured for them to get up, moving quickly to guide them toward the door. Stay low and cover your mouths. Jamal instructed, leading them as they crawled along the floor. As they reached the doorway, Jamal could hear the roar of flames growing closer. He felt a surge of panic but pushed it down, focusing on getting the family to safety. They stumbled through the hallway, and Jamal could feel the heat growing more intense as the fire spread. Jamal! This way, one of his team members shouted, beckoning him toward the stairs. They rushed down, flames licking at their heels, the fire threatening to consume everything in its path. When they reached the front door, Jamal pushed the family ahead of him, urging them to get outside. The sight of the open air was a beacon of hope, and he felt a rush of relief wash over him as they emerged into the night. Get them to safety! Jamal shouted to his colleagues, who were waiting outside with blankets and water. He turned back toward the house, determined to ensure everyone was accounted for. As he stepped back inside, the heat was unbearable. Smoke stung his eyes, and he could feel the fire closing in around him. Yet he pressed forward, searching for any remaining occupants. Is anyone else here? He called, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He moved quickly, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Suddenly, he heard a faint cry from a corner of the living room. It was the family's dog, trapped beneath a pile of debris. Jamal's heart ached at the sight. He couldn't leave it behind. Hang on, buddy. I'm coming, he shouted, kneeling down to carefully move the debris away from the frightened animal. The flames roared closer, But Jamal remained focused, his heart racing with urgency. Finally, he managed to free the dog, cradling it in his arms. "I got you," he whispered, reassuring the trembling creature as he sprinted back toward the exit. Bursting through the front door, Jamal emerged into the fresh night air, gasping for breath. He collapsed to the ground, the weight of the night crashing over him. The Wilson family was safe, and he had rescued their dog, but he felt a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline coursing through his veins. Mr. Wilson stood nearby, shock and gratitude written across his face. "You saved them," he said, his voice trembling. Jamal looked up at him, panting heavily, the reality of the night settling in. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, feeling the weight of their earlier conflicts begin to shift. In this moment he was no longer just a firefighter, he was a hero. As the night wore on and the fire was brought under control, the Wilson family huddled together, grateful for their safety. Jamal found himself standing beside Mr. Wilson, the air thick with unspoken words. "I never thought I'd see the day where you'd be the one saving my family," Mr. Wilson finally admitted, his tone filled with a mix of humility and disbelief. "I'm sorry for how I treated you." Jamal met his gaze, feeling a flicker of understanding begin to bridge the gap between them. "We all make mistakes, sir. What matters is what we learn from them." In that moment, amidst the chaos and destruction, something shifted. Mr. Wilson's perspective was forced to change, and as they stood side by side, the boundaries that had once divided them began to blur. Jamal understood that this was a turning point, not just for himself, but for Mr. Wilson as well. Together, they could work toward building a better future, one where respect and understanding prevailed over. As the flames crackled and roared around him, Jamal knew the urgency of the situation was far from over. The fire had been contained to a section of the house, but the threat of its spread loomed ominously. His fellow firefighters worked diligently to keep the inferno at bay, their shouts and commands cutting through the smoke-filled air. "Jamal, we need you on the line," Tom shouted over the chaos. The fire was trying to breach the living room again, and their efforts were crucial. Jamal felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd just rescued Mr. Wilson's family, but now he was faced with the daunting task of ensuring the fire didn't spread further and jeopardize their lives or those of the other firefighters. Jamal took a deep breath, his lungs burning from the smoke, and raced toward the hose line. The water surged through the nozzle as he aimed it at the flames, feeling the power of the stream push back against the fire. His hands were steady as he focused on his target, dousing the flames that clawed at the walls with an intensity that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Keep it tight," Jamal yelled to his team, the words a rallying cry amidst the chaos. Each firefighter was a part of a larger machine, a well-oiled unit working together to combat the raging inferno. But as they fought, Jamal noticed a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The flames seemed to ignite with a new fury, roaring to life as if they had been re-energized by some unseen force. Back, he yelled, sensing the danger. "We need to pull back and regroup." The fire crackled menacingly, and an ominous creaking sound echoed through the house as the flames consumed the structural integrity of the ceiling. It was a warning sign, one that sent a chill down Jamal's spine. "We can't let it spread to the upper floors," he thought desperately, knowing that the Wilsons were still in shock just outside. With the team reluctantly retreating, Jamal felt a surge of determination rise within him. The last thing he wanted was for the family to suffer any further. He wouldn't allow it. "I can get to the source," he muttered under his breath, his mind racing with the possible outcomes of his actions. "Jamal, are you crazy?" Tom called out, catching Jamal's eye as he prepared to make a daring move back toward the flames. "We need to get everyone out. It's too dangerous." "I can do this," Jamal replied firmly, his heart pounding. "Just cover me while I cut off the flames." Before Tom could argue further, Jamal plunged back into the inferno, determination fueling his every step. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud. His senses heightened as he navigated through the haze, the flames roaring above him, eager to consume all in their path. Jamal approached the center of the fire, where the blaze burned with an intensity that threatened to envelop him whole. He could feel the heat against his face, the roar of the flames resonating in his chest. Drawing on his training and instincts, he aimed the hose directly at the fire's heart. Come on, he urged himself, squeezing the nozzle and releasing a powerful burst of water that pushed back against the flames. The impact was exhilarating, but the fight was far from over. The fire sizzled and spat, retaliating with even greater fury. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the room. Jamal's heart raced as he realized the ceiling above him was beginning to give way. Not now. Please, not now, he thought, urgency coursing through his veins. As debris began to fall, Jamal ducked and maneuvered, narrowly avoiding the crashing wood and embers. I need to bring this under control, he shouted, pushing back with all his strength. The flames began to respond, but the danger loomed larger than ever. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. It was a bright flash, a glimpse of the family's prized possessions, which had begun to ignite. A wave of memories flooded his mind, the significance of their belongings resonating deeper than just material value. With renewed purpose, Jamal maneuvered closer, focusing his fire hose on the encroaching flames. I won't let you take their memories, he roared, determination coursing through his veins. He felt an adrenaline rush as he pressed forward, a firestorm in his eyes. Outside, Mr. Wilson watched in disbelief, the shock of the evening settling heavily on his shoulders. He had just witnessed Jamal save his family, and now he saw the firefighter risk his life to save what remained of their home. Emotions swirled within him, fear, gratitude, and a deep sense of humility. He turned to one of the other firefighters. Who is that man? He asked, the realization of his earlier prejudices flooding in. That's Jamal, your firefighter. He's one of the best, the firefighter responded, his voice filled with respect. He's risking everything for you right now. Inside, Jamal's senses were heightened as he pushed through the heat. The flames crackled and hissed, wrapping around him like a serpent, but he fought against it with all his might. I can't let this happen, he shouted, his voice strong despite the chaos surrounding him. He targeted the core of the blaze, aiming with precision. As he squeezed the nozzle, a powerful jet of water struck the flames, and he felt the resistance shift. The fire began to recede, the heat becoming more manageable. But just as Jamal thought he was making progress, the fire flared up again, sending a shower of sparks cascading toward him. No, 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 he cried, realizing he was surrounded. Time was running out. In that moment, as he fought against the engulfing flames, Jamal's training kicked in, and he reached for the secondary hose that had been forgotten in the chaos. With a swift movement, he connected it, aiming both hoses toward the heart of the blaze. Let's finish this, he yelled, summoning every ounce of strength as he unleashed a torrent of water. The sound of rushing water mixed with the roar of the flames, creating an intense clash of elements. Jamal pushed forward, refusing to back down, determined to protect the family that had once doubted him. With each moment that passed, the flames started to lose their grip, retreating under the relentless assault of water. The fire began to flicker, its power waning as Jamal held firm. He felt a rush of hope, their home might be saved after all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flames began to die down, collapsing into themselves. Jamal could hardly believe it. He had done it. The heat that had once been overwhelming was now merely a flicker, a dying ember. He stepped back, allowing himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline still coursed through him, but he had to ensure the fire was completely extinguished. As he surveyed the room, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over him. He had fought against the odds and emerged victorious, saving both the family and their home. Emerging from the house, Jamal was met with cheers from his fellow firefighters and the Wilson family. They were shaken but unharmed, gratitude etched on their faces as they gathered around him. You did it. You saved us, Mr. Wilson exclaimed, his voice filled with emotion. I just did my job, Jamal replied, humility washing over him. But deep inside, he felt the swell of pride at what he had accomplished. In the shadows of the fire, something had shifted between them. The man who once saw him as less than worthy now looked at him with newfound respect. Thank you, Jamal. I didn't realize how wrong I was, Mr. Wilson said, his voice trembling with sincerity. You saved my family, and I owe you everything. Jamal nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily. We all have our biases, sir. It's what we do next that matters, he replied, feeling the truth of his words sink in. This was a pivotal moment, not just for Mr. Wilson but for both of them. As the firefighters continued to extinguish the remaining embers, Jamal took a step back, allowing the emotions of the night to wash over him. He had faced the fire, not just the literal flames, but the metaphorical ones that had burned through the fabric of their lives. And he had come out on the other side, stronger and more resilient. The night was far from over, but for the first time, Jamal felt a sense of peace. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but in that moment, as he stood amidst the wreckage, he knew that the real battle had just begun. From the ashes of this experience, a new understanding had formed, a bridge over the divides that had once seemed insurmountable. And as he looked around at his colleagues, the Wilson family, and the flickering lights of the fire engines, Jamal knew that together, they could begin to heal. The fire had threatened to destroy everything, but instead, it had sparked a change, an opportunity for growth, understanding, and respect. And for Jamal, that was the true victory of the night. As the last remnants of smoke curled into the night sky and the firefighters began to pack up their equipment, a palpable sense of relief settled over the scene. The once raging fire had been tamed, but the emotional turmoil still lingered in the air. Jamal stood among his colleagues, sweat-soaked and weary, yet a fire of determination burned within him. He had faced the flames and emerged victorious, but this was more than just a successful rescue. It was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. Mr. Wilson moved through the crowd of firefighters, his eyes wide with gratitude as he shook hands and expressed his appreciation to each member of the team. Yet, he was still unaware of who had led the charge to save his family. Jamal watched from a distance, his heart racing as he prepared for what was about to unfold. The crowd buzzed with excitement, recounting the harrowing moments of the rescue, but the biggest revelation was yet to come. Thank you all so much," Mr. Wilson exclaimed, his voice carrying over the chatter. "I don't know how we can ever repay you. You all are heroes." He paused, scanning the faces around him, searching for the one who had saved his family. "But I need to know who it was that went back in there. Who risked it all?" The question hung in the air like a weight, and Jamal felt his pulse quicken. It was time. Stepping forward, he felt the eyes of his fellow firefighters on him, and he could sense the tension rising. The moment of truth was here. Jamal took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and slowly removed his helmet. The sound of metal scraping against fabric echoed in the stillness as he placed it under his arm. "That was me, sir," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm Jamal, your firefighter." Mr. Wilson's expression shifted from gratitude to disbelief as he stared at the man before him. The realization of who had saved his family began to dawn on him, and for a moment he was speechless. "You?" he finally managed, his brow furrowing in confusion and shock. You're the one who risked everything?" "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, his heart racing. "And I did it because I believe in doing what's right, regardless of the circumstances." The tension in the air thickened as Mr. Wilson processed this new reality. The man he had dismissed, the one he had looked down upon, was now standing before him as a hero. The fire that had once been a symbol of destruction now held a deeper significance, a moment of reckoning for both of them. But just as Mr. Wilson was about to respond, Jamal felt a wave of urgency wash over him. This moment wasn't just about recognition. It was about connection, about bridging the gap that had divided them for so long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded photograph, the edges worn and slightly faded from age. "Mr. Wilson," Jamal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want to show you something." Curiosity mixed with confusion as Mr. Wilson took the photograph, the corners of his mouth twitching into a frown as he glanced down at it. The picture was of a younger man, proud and standing in uniform, a firefighter just like Jamal, but with a familiar face. The man was Mr. Wilson's late father, and as the realization dawned, Jamal felt the weight of history pressing down on them. "This is your father," Jamal said quietly. And this is a picture of him in his early years as a firefighter. Mr. Wilson's eyes widened as he looked closer, recognizing the face he had seen only in old family photos. How do you have this?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because, sir," Jamal replied, his voice steadying. "Your father was saved by my father many years ago. They were brothers in arms, fighting together against the same flames. Your father had great respect for my family, but I don't think you ever knew that." A heavy silence enveloped them as Mr. Wilson processed the implications of Jamal's words. The connection that had once been obscured by prejudice and misunderstanding was now illuminated, casting a new light on their relationship. "My father spoke about it often," Jamal continued, his gaze unwavering. "He respected your father immensely and was proud to have fought alongside him. I carry that respect with me, even as you've treated me otherwise. I hope this moment can change things between us." Mr. Wilson's expression shifted as a wave of emotions crossed his face. The realization of his father's legacy collided with the painful truth of his own ignorance. He had looked down on Jamal, dismissing him as just another employee, when in fact, they were connected by a bond forged in bravery and sacrifice. "I had no idea," Mr. Wilson began, his voice trembling. "I didn't know the history, the respect. I've been so focused on my own views, my own biases, that I failed to see the truth. You saved my family tonight, and I didn't even know it was you." Tears glimmered in Mr. Wilson's eyes as he struggled to find the right words. Jamal felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. This moment was a turning point, but it was also a test of whether their past could be reconciled with their present. "I was wrong, Jamal," Mr. Wilson admitted, the weight of his admission heavy in the air. "I'm ashamed of how I've treated you. My father would have never condoned it. He believed in equality, in respect for all, regardless of color. You showed me tonight what it truly means to be brave." The acknowledgement hung in the air, and Jamal felt a rush of hope. "It's not too late to change," he replied, his voice warm. "We all have the power to grow, to learn from our mistakes. I hope we can honor our father's legacy together." As Mr. Wilson looked into Jamal's eyes, he felt a sense of clarity wash over him. The barriers that had once divided them began to crumble, replaced by a newfound understanding. "Thank you, Jamal. For everything. I want to do better. I want to honor the legacy of our fathers." With those words, the tension that had lingered between them dissipated, replaced by the potential for growth and healing. The community of firefighters and the Wilson family stood by, witnessing a powerful transformation unfold before their eyes, a bridge built from shared history and mutual respect. The night air, once thick with smoke and fear, now felt lighter. Jamal smiled, recognizing that this moment was just the beginning. As he looked at Mr. Wilson, he saw not just a boss but a man willing to change, a man willing to learn. "I'll be here every step of the way," Jamal assured him, a warmth filling his chest. "Let's work together to make a difference in our community, starting with our own perspectives." With the chaos of the night fading into the background, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fire had brought them together, illuminating the connections that had once been obscured by bias and misunderstanding. As the firefighters prepared to leave the scene, he knew that this was not just a story of heroism, it was a testament to the power of forgiveness and growth. In the days and weeks that followed, Jamal and Mr. Wilson began to collaborate, working to create programs that would foster understanding and unity within their community. They organized outreach initiatives, engaging with local schools and organizations to address the issues of racism and bias head-on. They spoke openly about their experiences, sharing their stories to inspire others to confront their prejudices and strive for a better future. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. Jamal became not just a firefighter but a mentor and a friend to Mr. Wilson. The bonds they forged transcended the boundaries that had once divided them, creating a legacy of respect and understanding that echoed through their community. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt still, Jamal often thought back to that night. The flames, the fear, the moment of revelation. It had been a turning point, not just for him but for everyone involved. As he looked around at the vibrant community they were building together, he knew that their journey was far from over. There would always be challenges to face, biases to confront, and flames to extinguish, but together, they could forge a path of understanding and respect. In the end, the fire had not just consumed the Wilson home, it had ignited a flame of change, illuminating the possibilities that lay ahead. Jamal smiled, knowing that he had not only saved a family but had also helped heal the wounds of the past, building a future where respect and understanding could thrive. As the weight of Jamal's words settled over the scene, Mr. Wilson stood frozen, staring at the photograph in his hands. His face, still flushed from the adrenaline of the fire, now reflected a complex mix of shock, shame, and realization. The photograph of his father, standing proudly alongside Jamal's father, felt heavier than any object he'd ever held. The irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The very people he had dismissed, looked down upon, and disrespected had saved his family, both generations of them. For a long, uncomfortable moment, no one spoke. The streetlights cast long shadows across the charred remains of the Wilson home, and the distant hum of fire trucks packing up was the only sound breaking the silence. Jamal had said all he needed to say. Now it was Mr. Wilson's turn to process the truth. He glanced up at Jamal, and for the first time, his usual smug confidence was gone. In its place was vulnerability, something raw and unfamiliar. His lips parted, but no words came out. He had spent years building his identity around a belief system that now crumbled in front of him. The foundation of his views on race, on superiority, on everything, was cracking under the weight of reality. His mind raced as he recalled all the casual slurs, the dismissive comments, the assumptions he had made about Jamal. Every moment of condescension now seemed to echo back at him, louder and more cutting than ever before. He felt exposed, as though the fire had burned away the facade he had so carefully crafted, leaving behind nothing but the truth of who he really was, and it wasn't a pretty picture. Jamal's father had saved Mr. Wilson's father, and now Jamal had saved Mr. Wilson's family. There was no room for debate, no argument that could justify the way Mr. Wilson had treated Jamal. The truth was undeniable, and it left Mr. Wilson standing there, hollow and speechless. The photo trembled slightly in his hands as he tried to come to grips with it all. His father had been a man of integrity, a man who respected others regardless of their background. Mr. Wilson remembered stories from his youth, stories about the firehouse, about how his father had always spoken of the bravery of his fellow firefighters. But what Mr. Wilson had never realized was that one of those men was black, and now, that man's son had continued the legacy of heroism. The irony was suffocating. Mr. Wilson's throat tightened as he fought back tears. How had he become so blind, so consumed by ignorance? He had taken pride in being a self-made man, in controlling his destiny, but now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. His success, his life, and his very legacy had been built on the heroism of people he had spent his life disrespecting. For the first time in his life, Mr. Wilson didn't know what to say. His mouth felt dry, and his mind, usually quick to justify and argue, couldn't find a single excuse. The fire had stripped away the pretense, leaving only the raw truth. Jamal, still standing quietly nearby, watched the internal struggle play out across Mr. Wilson's face. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in the man's discomfort. Instead, he simply waited, his expression calm but resolute. This moment wasn't about revenge or proving a point, it was about opening a door to change. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Wilson spoke, though his voice was barely a whisper. "I never knew." His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Jamal nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said quietly. "But now you do." Mr. Wilson's hands dropped to his sides, the photograph still clutched in his trembling fingers. His entire body seemed to deflate as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had spent years distancing himself from people like Jamal, convincing himself that he was better, that his life was somehow worth more. And yet here he was, standing in the ashes of his home, alive only because of the courage of the man he had underestimated. "I'm sorry," Mr. Wilson choked out, his voice thick with emotion. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't know what to say." Jamal didn't respond immediately. He let the apology linger, understanding that words alone weren't enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted over the years. But he also understood the power of this moment. It wasn't just about Mr. Wilson's remorse, it was about the possibility of change. "You don't have to say anything right now," Jamal finally said, his voice steady but kind. "What matters is what you do next." Mr. Wilson looked down at the photograph again, his grip tightening on it. "My father," he began, his voice cracking. "He would have been ashamed of me." Jamal stepped forward slightly, his gaze softening. "Your father wasn't perfect either," he said gently. But he understood something important, that respect isn't about the color of someone's skin. It's about their actions, their character. We all have the chance to learn that. The words seemed to hit Mr. Wilson like a tidal wave. He had spent so much time living in the shadow of his father's legacy, but he had twisted it into something unrecognizable. Now, standing face to face with the son of the man who had saved his father's life, he realized just how far off course he had gone. Tears finally broke free and rolled down Mr. Wilson's cheeks as he took a deep breath. His whole body shook with the weight of his emotions, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel the shame, the guilt, the regret. It was painful, but it was necessary. Jamal didn't look away. He allowed Mr. Wilson the space to experience that vulnerability, knowing that it was a crucial step in the man's transformation. This wasn't about humiliating him, it was about allowing him to see the truth so that he could start to make amends, not just with Jamal, but with himself. "I don't know how to fix this," Mr. Wilson whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know where to start." Jamal exhaled softly and offered a small, reassuring nod. "You start by recognizing that you were wrong. And then you take responsibility. It's not easy, but it's the only way forward." Mr. Wilson wiped at his eyes, his heart heavy with the realization that he had been blind for so long. He looked at Jamal, seeing him not just as a firefighter or an employee, but as a human being, someone who had shown him more grace and patience than he ever deserved. "I want to make this right," Mr. Wilson said, his voice firmer now, though still laced with regret. "I don't know how, but I'm going to find a way. I promise." Jamal nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "Actions speak louder than words," he said. "But I believe you, Mr. Wilson. It's not about where you've been, it's about where you're willing to go." Mr. Wilson's chest tightened as the weight of those words settled in. This was his chance, his opportunity to change, to be better than he had been. And while it wouldn't erase the past, it could reshape the future. He wasn't just thinking about himself anymore. He was thinking about his family, his community, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. With a heavy but hopeful heart, Mr. Wilson extended his hand toward Jamal. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "For everything." Jamal hesitated for only a moment before reaching out and shaking his hand. It was a small gesture, but it signified something much bigger. A commitment to change, to understanding, and to growth. As the night drew to a close and the remaining firefighters began to depart, Jamal and Mr. Wilson stood together, united by a shared history and an uncertain but hopeful future. For Mr. Wilson, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would strive to live up to the legacy of respect and honor that his father had left behind. And as they both walked away from the scene, the flickering embers of the fire behind them, it was clear that the flames had ignited something far more powerful, the possibility of redemption, understanding, and change. As the last of the embers cooled and the fire crews packed their gear, the night air was filled with the quiet aftermath of the rescue. Mr. Wilson stood in front of what remained of his house, but something deeper had been rebuilt within him. He looked at Jamal one more time, realizing that this wasn't just about a house being saved, it was about saving himself from the ignorance he had lived in for so long. "Tonight I lost my home," Mr. Wilson said, turning to Jamal. "But I found something far more important, perspective." Jamal gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "It's never too late to start over, Mr. Wilson. Sometimes it takes a fire to burn away the walls we've built around our hearts. Don't wait for tragedy to open your eyes. Start today. What we do next defines who we are." Did this story hit home for you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences or moments where you had to confront a difficult truth about yourself or others. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story made you think, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. You never know when the next twist will remind us all of the value of empathy and understanding. Have you ever experienced a moment that made you rethink everything you believed? Share your story with us in the comments. Your voice matters.